Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, to our men's group and our study in the Gospel of John. We're going to pick up with the triad on the left. We're going to take a look at chapter 18, verses 28 through 40, and the transfer of Jesus to Pontius Pilate after the Sanhedrin had carried out their formal trial. We see in block 1, verses 28 through 32, that Pilate did expect this transfer because he would have been the individual who approved the spira of 200 men to accompany the Sanhedrin to arrest Jesus. This was Friday around 3 to 6 a.m. Thursday had been the meal in the upper room. Saturday was feast day. Friday was the day when the Paschal lambs were slaughtered. Now the formal trial by Caiaphas had condemned Jesus to death, and they took him to Pilate for the execution of that judgment. And we know that John has some eyewitness information here, and we know that John did follow Jesus into the high priest court palace. We do know that John stood at the foot of the cross, and he may have found some way to actually enter into the court of Pilate also in some way. And Pilate was probably staying at the castle of Antonia, which was just northwest of the temple. And actually, the porch area did attach and join to the temple. And the Sanhedrin charges that they brought to present to Pilate consisted of 3 political charges against Jesus, that being seditious agitation, the forbidding of the giving of tribute to Caesar, and the claim to be king of the Jews. And in verse 28, the chamber of priests did not enter into the judgment hall after they arrived because they didn't want to be defiled by entering into the pagan residence, because this was Passover. They didn't want to be ukmeano. They did not want to be stained or defiled for Passover. Now Pilate asked the Sanhedrin, what charge do you bring concerning this man? And their answer in verse 30 is simply that he is kekos poieo, he is an evil doer. That's all they say to Pilate. They just say, well, he is an evil doer. And with that kind of a vague description of a charge, Pilate suggests they resolve the issue according to their own laws and to leave him alone and just leave him out of it. But they tell him that they are not allowed to carry out any kind of a death sentence type of judgment. And so this development does fulfill what Jesus had prophesied earlier, that he would be lifted up on the cross. This falls back on John 12:32 through 33. When Jesus had made that prophetic announcement. On block 2, we're going to look at 33 through 37. And in Acts 5:13, we have Simon Peter under Solomon's colonnade accusing the Jews of preferring Barabbas over Jesus at the court of Pontius Pilate. So he refers back to this incident. Now, from this verses 33 to 37, we have Jesus giving the gospel the title of the truth, and that is unique to John's gospel. It's only John's gospel and John's letters, epistles, that actually speak of the gospel as the truth. And then note 3 there, the truth had previously been told to the Jewish people in the blessings and the curses of Deuteronomy 27:12 and 13, but now Christ bears witness to the truth through his incarnate ministry. Jesus Christ bears witness to the truth through his incarnate ministry. And in verse 33, Pilate asks Jesus if he is king of the Jews. Are you the basileus? Are you the king or the ruler of the Jews? And Jesus asks if others are behind that accusation. Specifically, is it the chamber of priests that are really asking this through you? And then note 4, we've got to, in verse 35, Pilate does confess that the chamber of priests of the Sanhedrin have delivered him. So the ultimate guilt, we're going to find that Jesus says the greatest guilt does fall on the Sanhedrin, and specifically the chamber of priests, because they paradidomai delivered him over for execution. But in verse 36 we have the famous, well-known verse. Jesus declares that his kingdom is not of this world. It is uk to cosmu. It is not of the world and not from this secular place, this secular domain. And instead, he says in verse 37 that Jesus says he bears the witness to the truth. His purpose, his birth, was for the purpose of bearing witness to the divine aletheia truth. And those of his kingdom are those who hear the rhema voice of the Logos in his teachings. Those that have been opened and drawn by the Father, they are the ones who hear the rhema voice of the Logos. They become his followers. But they are those that have been drawn by the Father to the Son. Now in verses 38 through 40, we have the exclusion of Herod. It's interesting that John, the apostle, does not include the narrative of the Pontius Pilate delivering Jesus over to Herod, and then Herod in turn sending him back to Pilate. That's excluded from John's gospel. And we're going to see that there's a reason for this. If you look at block 3, the sending of Jesus to Herod Antipas is omitted by John. He wants to concentrate on the guilt solely falling on the Sanhedrin, solely falling on false Judaism, especially the chamber of priests and the head of the chamber of priests, Ananias. John wants to specifically place all of the guilt on the Sanhedrin, on false Judaism, and on Ananias and Caiaphas, not on the pagan Herod Antipas. Now Herod, he had come from Tiberias in Galilee, and Pilate had come from Caesarea in order to keep order during Passover. So they both had traveled from where they normally were based, normally from where their headquarters normally was. And we know that in Insight 3 there, that some of the multitude hoped to deliver Jesus by the plea of the feast. But the chamber of priests stirred the crowd to yell for Barabbas instead. We find that in Luke 23, 4 through 12. And that's exactly what John's trying to do here. John is trying to, by his, he's not changing any truth, but he is excluding the inclusion of Herod, and he's leaving out the pagan King Herod. And he's concentrating exclusively on Ananias and Pontius Pilate, and especially the chamber of priests. He is totally concentrating on the chamber of priests as being the guilty party. So even though Jesus was a Galilean and in Herod's jurisdiction, the sending of Herod in Luke 23, 6 through 12 is omitted. But in verse 38, Pilate does announce to the crowd that he finds no fault with Jesus. No cause, no reason, no ground for any accusation whatsoever. He finds no reason for an accusation against Jesus. And he says that according to custom, he will release one prisoner because it is Passover. And of course, the chamber of priests incite the crowd to demand Barabbas instead of Jesus. And so in verse 40, the crowd cries out for Barabbas. And he was an insurrectionist, a revolutionary, and a bandit. And so it's ironic that actually the Jews were accusing Jesus of being a revolutionary and an insurrectionist against the state. And the crowd asked for Barabbas, who actually was arrested for those reasons. We find that The Apostle John is very much interested in his theme of a theological gospel that emphasizes a new exodus, and the new exodus is out of false Judaism. So he is not interested in complicating the issue. He wants to even exclude Herod from the narrative. So for John, all of the blame, all of the guilt, all of the sin falls on the chamber of priests. All of the sin falls on the Sanhedrin. So we'll move on to chapter 19 now in the right triad. And we're going to look at 1 through 6. Sanhedrin shout, "Crucify." Now, we know that death frequently resulted from the flogging and the scourging. And the whip that was used was called a scorpion. It had leather thongs with lead balls on the end, and the lead balls had sharp spikes. Now, Luke is the only gospel that does not mention the crown of thorns. All the other gospels do mention the crown of thorns. But Pilate did order Jesus scourged or flogged, and that is mastagao, which means to flog a victim strapped to a pole, and to use a mastix, a lash of leather thongs with pieces of metal on the ends. They also mocked him with a crown of thorns, and they hailed him as King of the Jews. And it also says in the scriptures that they struck him. So they also rapidzo, struck him, slapped him on the face as they mocked him. And after this flogging and ripping his flesh from his body, which, like I said, many people died just from the flogging. Then they put a purple robe on him and the crown of thorns, and Pilate represents Jesus to the crowd, but declares to them that he's found no guilt in him, no reason for an accusation. He finds him innocent. Yet he still ordered this scourging, but he says, I find no reason for guilt in him at all. And then he announces, Harao autan, behold him. And that's going to evolve as we go through the narrative here, because Pilate's going to go from behold him to behold the man, and then finally to behold your king. So it's going to be behold him. There's going to be a second presentation, behold the man. There's going to be a third presentation, behold your king. But he finds no reason to justify any charge against Jesus. And the second time he does present Jesus again and pronounces, behold the man, Harao anthropos. But we know that in verse 6 that the chamber of priests again, which are of the Sanhedrin, they cry out, crucify him, over and over and over again, crucify him. And it is the chamber of priests, and it is the ministers that assist the chamber of priests. So it's primarily, those are the representatives of the Sanhedrin that are present. It is the chamber of priests and the assistant ministers to the chamber of priests. And they are screaming out loud, kraugadzo, they are exclaiming loudly in the imperative, crucify, 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 over and over and over again. So they keep petitioning Pilate. They want Jesus executed. And so we'll go to the second block, verses 7 through 11, and we're going to take a look at the Sanhedrin have the greatest sin. And the judgment of death for blasphemy is found in Leviticus 24:16. Hebrews 2:17 is significant here because it tells us that Jesus became fully human so that he could be an effective and merciful high priest for us. We had the high priest prayer in 17, and we have Jesus who suffers all things to be a merciful, understanding high priest for all humanity. Now in Insight 3, Pilate is not free from sin by any means because he does condemn Jesus contrary to his conviction of innocence. He keeps proclaiming that he is convicted that Jesus is innocent, and yet he has him flogged, he has him beaten near to death. He's not free from sin by any means, even though he keeps trying to release Jesus. That doesn't prevent him from torturing him. Now the chamber of priests declared Jesus should die because he claimed he was a son of God. A huion theou poieo. He made himself a son of God. And when this is proclaimed, Pilate gets really nervous. It says that he gets malan phobeo. He gets a deep sense of dread that he's dealing with someone who's the son of God. He starts to get terrified, and he really gets a subjective feeling of dread. And so he goes back to Jesus, and he says, "Where are you from? What place are you from?" And Jesus does not reply at all. He just remains silent. And when this happens, Pilate can't understand the silence. He says, "Don't you know I've got the power over life and death? Echo exousia, I have the power to release you. I have the power to crucify you. I have the power of life and death." And that's when he gets rebuked and corrected by Jesus in verse 11, when Jesus says that all power is from above. All power is from above. And the greatest sin in this situation belongs to the Sanhedrin, to the chamber of priests who delivered him to Pilate. Jesus, from the mouth of Jesus himself, he says the greatest sin is placed on the Sanhedrin. But all power is from heaven. And it's interesting, this phrase also means all power is from the beginning, the one who creates. All power is from the beginning. All power is from heaven. And the megas hamartia, the greatest sin, is on the chamber of priests in the Sanhedrin. They are guilty of the greatest sin. And that'll take us on to block 3, the slaughtering of the lambs. And in verse 14, it establishes our timetable. And so I went to Bible Hub because there's a lot of controversy over the timetable concerning the crucifixion. But I've found that the Bible Hub is a fairly reliable, very conservative reference, and I trust them. And so I've placed this timetable here, which is, I think, the best that I could find anyway. And basically it's 12 a.m. on Friday. The arrest takes place in Gethsemane. 1 a.m. Jesus is brought before Ananias. From 3 to 4 a.m. he's brought before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin trial. At 6 a.m. he is transferred to Pilate. At 7 a.m. he is transferred to Herod. That's omitted by John. But at 7 a.m. he's transferred to Herod. And then Herod transfers him back to Pilate around 8 a.m. Now the crucifixion runs from 9 to 12 noon. You've got the fact that Christ had to bear his own cross. It runs from about 9 till 12 noon for the crucifixion. And then there was the 3 hours of darkness from noon till 3 p.m. During the crucifixion. And then 3 p.m. on the Friday was the preparation day of the slaughter of the Paschal lambs. And that's the hour, the timing that Jesus spoke of all along, that his hour had not yet come, because his hour was timed where he would be crucified as the Paschal lamb, and therefore he was crucified during Passover preparation day, Friday at 3 p.m. And so it gives us a pretty good workable timetable, so I've added that in here, and it comes from Bible Hub, very conservative reference site, and I do trust their timetable from the ones I looked at. This seemed like the best adaptation. Now Pilate, in verse 12, he next seeks to release Jesus, but the Sanhedrin uses Caesar's name for leverage. They say that they cry out loud that you are not a friend of Caesar's if you release Jesus. So Pilate finally does take his judgment seat, the throne on the elevated platform that was all paved in mosaic tile. And then we have that third presentation. And this time Pilate says, "Behold your king." We've gone from him to the man to your king. But when he makes a presentation, again, it's the chamber of priests and the Sanhedrin that cry out, Stauersan auton, Stauersan auton. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. They just shout again and again and again. And that's why this section is titled The Great Sin of the Sanhedrin. Jesus had already declared to Pilate that the greatest sin falls on the Sanhedrin. And for the Apostle John, he doesn't want Herod even included in this. He wants all the weight of guilt to go on false Judaism, all of the weight and all of the sin to fall on the Sanhedrin. And so that's exactly the voice of this theological gospel, that Jesus is the deliverer to deliver God's chosen elect out of false Judaism into the new covenant. So we get great insight here, I think. One thing we fully understand with John's emphasis in his gospel is that he does dedicate that full chapter 17 to Jesus Christ as the eternal high priest who intercedes for us, but he's the eternal high priest who also has suffered torment after torment after torment because of his fully human nature in order to become a merciful and loving high priest who is continually praying and petitioning to the Father on our behalf while being seated at the right hand of the Father. He is always working and interceding for us in prayer and in offerings, and he is our eternal high priest. But he is also the slaughtered paschal lamb who suffered all things to become the merciful high priest. So we have a great lesson here, but we really do see the uniqueness of these inerrant Gospels. All of the Gospels are the inerrant, living Word of God, God-breathed, eternal, inerrant Scripture. But they all are different in the sense that each reflects its own voice. And the Gospel of John is a theological gospel. We've already talked about that. He arranges things theologically to emphasize a theological theme, and that theme is the new covenant as the new Exodus. That is his theme. Absolutely, that is his new theme, to deliver the elect out of false Judaism, which had become extremely oppressive. And he holds that same theme up again here by excluding Herod altogether and pouring all of the guilt, all of the sin, the greatest of sin, on the chamber of priests in the Sanhedrin. And that's going to take us up through next time we'll pick up at 1916.